Some of them lean, some creak in the wind, some look like they could fall over tomorrow. And yet, they're still here. All across Europe, medieval houses built 6, even 7 centuries ago are still standing. But how? Before concrete, steel, and modern tools, how did builders create homes that could last through wars, storms, and centuries of use? In this story, we'll uncover the secrets behind their survival. From timber joints to town planning, from roof thatch to daily habits, you'll see how medieval homes weren't just built to last. They were built to live. This is the story of how medieval houses stayed standing for centuries. When you walk through a preserved medieval town today, past crooked timber-framed houses, leaning doorways, and narrow cobbled streets, it's easy to forget how ancient these structures really are. Many of them have survived for 5, 6, even 7 centuries. They have weathered wars, plagues, revolutions, and the steady march of time. How could buildings made with simple tools, primitive materials, and no modern technology endure for so long? The answer lies in a blend of clever design, local resources, constant maintenance, and an understanding of nature that modern builders sometimes forget. In the early Middle Ages, roughly between the 9th and 12th centuries, most houses were modest and temporary. For common folk, homes were built quickly using wattle and daub, woven wooden sticks plastered with a muddy mixture of clay, straw, and dung. These structures might last a generation, maybe 2, but they weren't built with centuries in mind. But as stability grew, towns expanded, and commerce flourished, the architecture evolved. By the 13th and 14th centuries, especially in growing towns across England, France, and Germany, a new style of building emerged, one that would change the skyline forever. Timber framing was at the heart of this transformation. In a world without steel beams or concrete, timber was the strongest material available. Great oaks, chestnuts, and elms were felled, cut, and shaped by hand. Carpenters developed intricate methods to join heavy beams together without nails, using wooden pegs, known as trenails, and precise joinery techniques like mortise and tenon. The frames themselves were constructed like giant, three-dimensional puzzles, strong, flexible, and capable of shifting slightly with the earth over centuries without breaking apart. The flexibility was key. Where rigid stone might crack under pressure, a timber-framed house could sway gently during storms, settling naturally over time. Builders anchored these frames onto simple stone foundations, often just a perimeter of local stones laid dry, without mortar. These foundations kept the wood off the damp ground, protecting it from rot. Even simple elevation, a few feet above the soil, could dramatically increase a building's life. Walls were filled with lighter materials like wattle and daub, brick, or rubble masonry, depending on regional traditions and resources. In some areas, especially wealthier towns, the gaps were filled with small stones set in lime mortar, giving a sturdier shell. In others, painted or whitewashed daub created the famous black and white timbered look we associate with medieval towns today. The roof, always a critical component, was designed steeply, not just for aesthetics but for practical survival. Rain and snow slid off quickly. Thatched roofs made from straw or reeds were common in early medieval homes. Later, clay tiles and wooden shingles became preferred materials for wealthier households and town buildings. Roofs extended far beyond the walls to protect the vulnerable wattle and daub from rainfall. But construction alone wasn't enough. Medieval builders knew their materials lived and breathed. What expanded in humidity contracted in cold. Walls cracked, beams warped. That was expected, and it was embraced. Houses were maintained continuously, beams replaced, thatch patched, plaster repaired. A medieval house was never finished. It was a living thing, constantly cared for. Moreover, communities often shared responsibility. In many towns, regulations required homeowners to keep their houses in good repair, not just for beauty, but to prevent fires, collapses, and hazards to neighbors. The result? A kind of architecture that was deeply local, deeply adaptive, and incredibly resilient. Even the crooked look of many medieval houses, leaning sideways, slanting forward over the street, was a feature, not a flaw. Builders often intentionally allowed upper floors to overhang the street, both to maximize interior space and to shelter the ground floor from rain. In the next part, we'll journey deeper into the secret techniques medieval carpenters used, and why the way they cut, shaped, and assembled timber made all the difference between a house that collapsed after 50 years and one that could stand for 600. Medieval builders were craftsmen, but to build a house that could last centuries, they needed more than just strong arms. They needed knowledge passed down through generations, a silent language carved into every beam and joint. The most critical part of a medieval house was its frame, the skeleton on which everything else relied. And not just any wood would do. Carpenters chose their timber carefully. Oak was the gold standard. It grew tall and straight, was naturally resistant to insects and rot, and could bear heavy loads. In regions without oak, builders used other hardwoods like chestnut, ash, or elm. But material choice was just the beginning. The timing of the harvest mattered too. Trees were often felled in winter, when the sap was low. Winter-cut timber was denser, dried more slowly, and was less prone to warping or rotting over time. Some builders even believed that trees felled during certain lunar phases, particularly during a waning moon, produced stronger wood. Whether superstition or early science, the care taken was real. Once cut, the timber wasn't rushed into use. It was seasoned, allowed to dry naturally for months, sometimes years, under shelter. This slow drying prevented catastrophic cracking and kept the wood's strength intact. When the beams were ready, medieval carpenters shaped them using axes, adzes, and saws, hand tools that left distinctive tool marks still visible in some ancient homes today. Each beam was custom-fitted, hand-hewn to match its place in the frame. There was no standardization, no factory-made parts. Every frame was a unique creation. The genius of medieval carpentry lay in the joinery. Rather than rely on metal nails, which could corrode and weaken over time, builders connected beams with mortise and tenon joints, a method where one end of a beam, the tenon, was carved into a tongue that fit snugly into a hole, the mortise, in another beam. Once fitted, the joint was secured with a wooden peg, often slightly dried beforehand so it would swell in place and tighten the bond over time. These joints allowed the entire structure to flex without snapping, crucial when heavy winds or shifting foundations stressed the building. In fact, the frame of a medieval house was often described as a box that breathes. It could expand, contract, and settle gently without tearing itself apart. Another clever technique was splaying, angling posts and beams slightly outward or inward to distribute weight and allow for settling. What looks today like a crooked house may have been designed that way deliberately, anticipating the natural movement of wood and earth across centuries. Builders also used brace beams, angled supports that strengthened the corners and kept walls from bowing outward. Without modern screws or brackets, these triangular shapes gave rigidity and strength, forming internal skeletons that made collapse less likely. But perhaps most fascinating was the way carpenters marked their work. Using small cuts, called carpenter's marks, builders labeled each piece of timber, a medieval coding system showing where each piece fit in the puzzle. In large projects, dozens or even hundreds of timbers were pre-shaped, then assembled on-site like a giant three-dimensional blueprint. And once assembled, the frame was a living organism able to shift, creak, and settle without breaking apart. To an outsider, a medieval timber-framed house might look rough, irregular, even unstable. But to a trained eye, it was a masterpiece of adaptive engineering, a structure designed to endure the unpredictable forces of time. In the next part, we'll explore how town planning, community rules, and fire regulations played a hidden role in helping these ancient houses survive for so long. It wasn't just clever carpentry that kept medieval houses standing, it was also the way towns and communities were built around them. In the Middle Ages, life was deeply interconnected. A house didn't stand alone. It leaned, physically and metaphorically, on its neighbors. In medieval towns, buildings were packed tightly together, forming dense webs of homes, shops, inns, and workshops. Streets were narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Upper floors jutted out over the streets, meeting the eaves of neighboring houses like clasped hands. These overhanging structures, known as jettying, weren't just a way to maximize space. They also helped to brace houses against each other. The buildings supported one another, sharing the burden of heavy winds, shifting ground, and time itself. In a way, each house helped hold the next one up. But there was a downside to such closeness: fire. A single spark could destroy an entire street. Wooden houses, thatched roofs, and open flames were a deadly combination. To survive centuries, medieval towns needed more than good carpenters. They needed strict rules and constant vigilance. Many medieval cities developed early building codes to combat the threat of fire. Town charters from as early as the 12th century included regulations about roofing materials, chimney construction, and open flames. In London, for example, after devastating fires in the 13th century, thatched roofs were banned in favor of clay tiles. Other towns required regular inspections of hearths and chimneys. Some cities even organized watchmen whose sole job was to patrol the streets at night, looking for signs of fire and raising the alarm if needed. Bells were installed in church towers not just to call to prayer, but to warn of danger. In some towns, citizens were required to keep buckets of water ready by their doors after dark. Individual households were also responsible for their own maintenance. In bustling merchant towns, a collapsing house wasn't just a personal disaster. It threatened neighbors, customers, and travelers. As a result, property owners were often legally obligated to repair damaged beams, fix broken tiles, and reinforce sagging walls. When disputes arose, say, if one neighbor's roofline caused water to spill into another's home, town courts handled the conflicts. Maintaining your house wasn't just a matter of pride, it was a legal duty. Beyond regulations, cultural habits helped preserve medieval houses. Unlike modern throwaway culture, medieval people lived with the understanding that everything, homes, clothes, tools, must be repaired, not replaced. A cracked beam wasn't a reason to tear down a house. It was a reason to patch, bolster, and keep going. And so, homes evolved organically over time. Walls were thickened, roofs were repaired with different materials. Extensions were added as families grew. No two houses aged the same way, and that irregularity, those slight tilts and crooked beams, became part of their charm. Even the materials chosen for townhouses reflected a communal mindset. Timber framing offered flexibility. Wattle and daub could be patched easily. Stone foundations were used, absorbed moisture, and resisted rot. Every material was selected with resilience in mind. In a sense, medieval towns were living organisms, breathing, growing, and healing themselves year after year, century after century. In the next part, we'll step inside these homes and discover how interior design, building practices, and daily habits quietly contributed to the survival of these enduring medieval treasures. A medieval house wasn't just a structure. It was a part of daily life, almost like a living companion. And to survive century after century, it needed care, attention, and a way of living that modern homes rarely require. Step inside a medieval home, and you'd quickly realize that life revolved around preserving the building as much as living within it. First, there was the matter of moisture, the silent enemy of every medieval house. With no modern waterproofing, rain, snow, and even damp air could slowly rot timbers, crumble walls, and warp floors. Medieval people understood this intuitively. Floors were typically raised slightly above ground level to avoid direct contact with moisture. In many homes, stone slabs or packed earth formed the floor, later covered with rushes or straw, which were regularly changed to keep things dry and clean. In wealthier homes, wooden floorboards were laid, and extra care was taken to keep them dry by hanging tapestries to reduce dampness and circulating fresh air through narrow, cleverly placed windows. Roofs, the true shield of a house, received constant maintenance. Whether thatched with straw, layered with wooden shingles, or tiled with clay, medieval roofs needed regular attention. People patched leaks promptly, replacing damaged thatch and cracked tiles, because a leaking roof didn't just make you uncomfortable, it could destroy the entire frame of the house if left untended. Inside, hearths provided light, warmth, and cooking fires, but they were also the greatest fire hazard. Chimneys, when they existed, were often simple stone structures that needed regular cleaning. In poorer homes without proper chimneys, smoke was allowed to drift upward through holes in the roof or simple vents. Managing the hearth was a skill. Too much smoke and soot would damage the house. Too little attention and a fire could destroy it. Medieval living habits also helped houses last. People typically concentrated activities in specific parts of the home. Heavy tasks like baking, brewing, and laundry, all involving fire and water, were often done outside in separate buildings or covered courtyards to protect the main structure from accidents and moisture. Even larger manor houses and castles had separate kitchens and bakehouses, detached from the living quarters for this very reason. Furniture was built with the house in mind too. Heavy, solid pieces like oak chests and trestle tables didn't stress the timber floors with constant movement. Instead of permanent fixtures, much of the furniture was movable. Trestle tables could be assembled for meals and taken down afterward, limiting wear on the floor and space. And when additions or repairs were needed, they were done with sensitivity to the building structure. Builders didn't fight the house's settling or shifting, they adapted to it. New beams were added alongside old ones. New walls were leaned into existing frames. Nothing was perfect, but everything was functional. Importantly, medieval people lived in rhythm with the seasons, adjusting how they used their homes based on weather and light. Heavy shutters protected windows during storms. Thick woolen tapestries were hung during winter to insulate rooms, while lighter fabrics were swapped in summer. Firewood was stockpiled in advance to avoid damp, rushed cuts that could smoke and stain walls. It was a way of life that treated the house not as a static object, but as a changing, breathing shelter, one that needed respect, adaptation, and constant care. And because of that quiet, persistent effort, many of these homes still stand today. In the final part, we'll look at how time itself transformed these houses, why some still survive today, and what lessons they quietly whisper to us across the centuries. Today, when we walk down the twisting lanes of medieval towns, through York, Rothenburg, Bruges, or Sarlat, we see houses that have stood against the battering of centuries. Their beams are bowed, their walls lean, their windows are uneven. Yet, somehow, they endure. Why did these medieval houses survive when so many later buildings, seemingly better equipped with modern materials, have not? The answer lies not in technological marvels, but in respect for materials, a culture of repair, and an acceptance of imperfection. Medieval builders worked with nature, not against it. They understood that timber moves, earth settles, roofs leak, and walls crack, and they built accordingly. They chose strong, local materials and crafted with flexibility in mind. They made peace with change rather than trying to freeze a building in time. Medieval townspeople accepted that their homes would evolve. Walls would be patched, beams would be braced, rooms would be reconfigured as families grew or fortunes changed. A house wasn't a finished product, it was a living thing, growing older alongside its owners. The houses that have survived the longest are the ones that were loved enough to be maintained. Every few years, a roof might be retiled. Every few decades, a frame might be reinforced. Every generation, a window might be replaced. Tiny acts of stewardship, repeated over centuries, kept these homes alive. Ironically, some of their quirks, the very things that make them seem so ancient today, are signs of their survival. The slanted beams? A house that has settled gently instead of snapping apart. The uneven floors? A building that has flexed and breathed with changing soil and shifting winds. Modern preservationists now understand what medieval builders knew intuitively. Rigid perfection leads to fragility, while flexible imperfection leads to resilience. In a world obsessed with sleekness and speed, medieval houses remind us of something deeper. To work with nature's rhythms, not against them. To build with the knowledge that nothing stays still forever. To value craft, patience, and care over appearance. They also whisper the truth that legacy isn't built in a day. It's not about grand beginnings or flawless finishes. It's about the quiet persistence of maintenance, adaptation, and a deep relationship with the world around us. And that is why so many medieval houses still stand today. They weren't frozen in time. They grew through time, built by hands that understood the woods, the winds, and the weight of the years, and cared enough to nurture them across generations. When you next walk beneath the leaning timbers of an old medieval street, know this: you are stepping not into a relic, but into a living story, still standing, still breathing, still telling its tale across the ages. Medieval houses didn't survive by accident. They survived through craftsmanship, care, and community. Which part of their construction or history surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss the next journey into the past. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next story.